that we started tonight's proceedings. So good evening, good morning, and good afternoon to everyone. This is in fact the penultimate in conservation with in the evening, that is, in this current series. And what better way to celebrate the penultimate night than to have Dominic Couzens with us? Now, for those who don't know even who Dominic is, I will attempt to kind of fill you in. There's not much to say really, because he is one of Britain's best known and most prolific writers. I mean, I've had a few on, as you probably know, in terms of in the past, we've had a few people on as writers, but he's written about 1 million books. I'm sure he's probably got that critical yet to come out this week. But he's also a popular tour guide, published numerous books and articles in natural history, including writing for magazines like the BBC Wildlife magazine and birdwatching magazines, plus the RSPB's Nature's Home. So he's in all the top, and even the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust magazine, you write for them as well. So he's in all the top and most important magazines. His books included books titles such as Extreme Birds and The Secret Life of Garden Birds and Britain's Mammals and Top 100 Sites of the World, Birding Sites of the World. You've also got a new book coming out, but before we talk about that and even say hello to you, I must say very briefly, thank you to our sponsors, Leica Nature and Birding, as well as King's Place Music Foundation, sponsoring this as part of their Nature Unwrapped year. So that's really good. So Dominic, good evening and welcome. How are you?
Good evening, David. It's really good to see. Pretty hot here as well in Dorset in the UK.
Oh, of course, you're in Dorset. Of course. Sorry?
It's a beautiful evening here.
Good. We've known each other for some time. By the way, you say it's a beautiful evening. Chris in Northumberland said it's raining and it's 60 centigrade. I'm sorry about that. We're very sorry about that. And Susie Buttress is saying there's lots of flying ants around. It's funny how people think that flying ants only come out on one day of the year. I read somewhere that is it like 98% of the summer? There's some point during a day in the summer that when the weather is actually appropriate, that ants will be flying. It's quite interesting.
Yeah. Sometimes it's 2 or 3 days, only one day.
Exactly. But I can't remember when I actually first met you, but we've known each other for some time now.
But David, you were young then.
We were young then, did you say?
Well, you were young. Yeah, I'm still young now, but you were young back then.
Okay. We're having a slight problem with your audio, by the way. I'm not sure if anyone else can hear, but a couple of your words are missing now and again, but we get the gag.
Yeah, it wasn't. Try and do better.
So yeah, so we've known each other. Do you remember when we actually first met?
I think it was at the bird in Rutland about probably 20 years ago.
Wow, that's some time ago.
It's a long time, isn't it?
It's funny how life moves on. So how was this whole pandemic been for you in England, in Dorset?
It's a bit embarrassing to admit, but actually it's been quite pleasant for me because I've not had the disease and nobody I know has had the disease. And so lockdown is very pleasant here. It was very quiet. You could hear the birds singing. I had plenty of work. I feel guilty saying it, but actually it has been fine for me. But I do know that it's caused a lot of misery around the world.
Of course. But on a lighter note, a lot of people have been talking about the fact that they've been hearing so many birds during lockdown. I'm sure you've been approached many times by various sources as to explain what was the reason for us hearing so many allegedly more birds than
I'm sure no one really heard, I don't think there was any more singing. Birds themselves, it's probably just that people could hear them, and there wasn't so much traffic or other background noise. Although, of course, we do know that birds have adapted their songs to sing louder when they live in cities. So maybe they didn't realize that us humans were all in lockdown, and so they sang as loudly as they normally do.
It's just felt weird being in lockdown, actually heard them change.
Yes, I think that's probably mainly the reason. But I mean, what a fantastic opportunity in some ways for people to hear the birds very close around them.
So whilst lockdown, I presume you walked around your neighbourhood. What sort of things were you seeing?
Well, the problem is that I've got a very nice neighbourhood. So I've got I've got a river at the bottom of my garden where we sometimes see otters, things like that. And so it was rather nice to be able just to walk around the garden, to be honest. There's lots of birds around here. It's a farmland area, so we had birds like corn buntings and yellow hammers and all sorts of nice things. I certainly added to my garden list. I know you did as well.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, let's take it back to the very beginning, to the young Dominic in the last century.
Thank you.
When was the first time you actually realised you were bitten by the bug? What was, as my American or our American colleagues may ask, what was your spark bird?
What was my spark bird? My spark bird was probably a house sparrow. I went for a walk from my London home, because I'd come from London like you do, David. And I walked up the road one day, probably in July, and I found an injured sparrow in the road.
What age were you?
Oh, I was probably 5 or 6. And I picked up this injured sparrow. I thought, wow, that's amazing. What an extraordinary bird it was. I was already interested in things like dinosaurs and reptiles and things like that. And then this, which of course birds are dinosaurs, but we didn't know that then. And I picked up this sparrow. I thought, wow, this is a really cool thing. And I guess I was on birds ever since. So ever since I was 6 years old.
And do you have what's your background in terms of, developing into the man you are today? What happened from that moment when you picked up the sparrow? How did your career progress from then?
Well, the moment of the sparrow coincided with, I think a lot of people have this, it coincided with a very sad time in my life, because my father died around that time. I was 6 when he died. And I think I was just, I withdrew very much into myself. And when life is quite so ghastly outside, you do look for some kind of escape. And I think the sparrow and onwards, and it turned into a complete obsession for me, as I know it you. It was an escape from the realities of the world. And I certainly never expected in the years to come that it would become a career. That was unheard of. This is talk about the 70s, 80s. No one had a career in birds or bird writing or anything like that. And so back then, it was just my escape. If anything was going badly, I could always make it to nature and birds, and if necessary, just reading about. I mean, by the time I was 12 or 13, a friend of mine and I, we decided there was no published list of birds of the world back then, so we thought we'd do one ourselves. And so we used to spend weeks just going through all the books we could find, writing down all the species of birds in the world. Again, that was a way of sort of getting away from a slightly dreary life that we found ourselves in.
It's funny because I did the exact same thing on my own, and in a way I'm still doing it to this day, adding names onto a list. But because now it's different because we have things like Bubo or the Handbook of the World online.
Indeed.
The birds of the world online, where you can actually all pre-prepared. But yeah, I can see that. So when did you first pick up a pen? What made you pick up a pen or pencil to write that bird?
Well, this came about by accident. I didn't really intend to be a writer. I wanted be a tour leader. So in my early 20s, I was doing a very boring job, just in an office. And I went away when I was young with my mum on a world tour. We just had a holiday for a couple of months.
As you do.
And as no, I know. It wasn't that amazing, just a few countries. But anyway, when we came back, I thought, I don't want to ever again. I don't want to do this. I want to go and try a different career. And so I decided to try to do some adult education programs to be the tutor of people who wanted to do some bird watching that way. Anyway, so I became a tour leader over the years, and I only took up writing sort of almost by mistake, really. I just thought, oh, I think I might try this. And it kind of did work rather well for me, because I've been doing it ever since.
What was the first thing you wrote about?
The first published thing I wrote was actually about gulls. It was a bird watching magazine. And it was sort of a humorous article about how sort of difficult it is to identify gulls. This is probably 86 or something like, no, 1990 this would be. And yeah, I just wrote for the first time, only time in my life, I wrote a whole article in about half an hour. And they published that, and then they asked me to do a column. This was Birdwatching magazine, the British version of Birdwatching magazine. And I've been writing for them pretty much ever since, which is about 25 years.
Quite a long time.
It's a very long time, and I'm wondering if anyone's getting fed up with it.
So how many books have you written? I mean, is that bookshelf all filled with all your books?
Oh no, the bookshelf behind me here, it knew there would be a few people watching today, so I picked out all my best books and I put them behind me so that I would look for them more intellectual than I normally do. Of course, I've got one of yours back there in case, just to curry favour with you. But this is a little bit embarrassing, but if you count books I've written with other people, it's up to 38 books. Wow.
So we're going to talk about garden birds. I mean, that's the whole thing. That's the whole kind of the evening is surrounded on.
Yeah.
But you've written 38 books.
Yes.
Briefly, what is your process? How do you write a book?
How do you write a book? Well, there's two ways of writing a book. You can you'll know this stuff, either come up with the idea, go to a publisher, or if you're really, really lucky, the publisher comes up with the idea and comes to you, which is very nice when they do that because it saves a lot of trouble and heartache. So assuming you have a commission one way or the other, you have a certain number of words to write. And what I do, my sort of professional modus operandi, if I have 50,000 words to do in 3 months, I kind of wait for 2.5 months, and then I write 50,000 words in the last 2 weeks. That's how it normally works. I know it shouldn't work like that, but I'm terrible for deadlines. Unless I have a deadline, I just can't get stuff done at all. I bet you're I'd like to know how you write your books.
Well, I've not met anyone yet who achieves the deadlines. I've not met anyone in my life who actually can sit down and say, right, I've been commissioned today. I want to do X amount of words per day until I get to the final day and I've done it. I've never met anyone that does that. So I have to say I'm like you. I mean, my first book, which was 70,000 words, The Urban Birder, I was given 9 months to write it, and I wrote all of it in the last month.
Wow,
I wrote it all out. So
there is a person we both know who the other way. Stephen Moss. Well, Stephen Moss, I know he's been on your podcast, and what he does is that he says, right, I'm going to write 3,000 words. He sits down, writes 3,000 words, and then he gets on with the next thing to do.
So he sticks to his guns in terms of his plan.
He's not human, I think.
So
Not like that.
some of us here might be, some of the Zoomers here might be familiar with Dominic's writing, not only in book form, but in, you know, in magazines like Birdwatching magazine. And what has always astounded me is your in-depth knowledge of birds generally. I mean, you talk about stuff that I've never known about birds, you know, the species. How did you amass that information? Have you got the sort of brain that kind of just soak up as much as possible?
No, my brain's not like that at all, actually. What tends to happen is that if a bird to write about, I literally just go onto Birds of the Western Palearctic or Birds of the World online, or I go to Google Scholar and look up all the papers about the bird. And I do it that way. I do it the laborious way. And if you look at enough articles about a bird, you can always find out something that you yourself weren't aware of. So, for example, recently I wrote an article on the European storm petrel. And as I was researching it, I didn't realize, I know this is meant to be about garden birds, by the way, sorry about that. But anyway, I wrote an article on storm petrels. What I didn't realize is that they very frequently at night during the summer feed over beaches, estuarine beaches. I always thought they were a sort of oceanic thing. And so I thought, oh, and so I thought, ooh, that's interesting. And if I have this, ooh, that's interesting feeling, then I follow that and hope that everyone else doesn't know that as well. Every single bird, though, I think is what I was saying to you last time we spoke on the phone, is that every bird has a story to tell. And there isn't a single bird in the world that you couldn't actually talk for an hour about. Everything, because birds are so well studied these days, most of them have extraordinary things found out about them. And that's...
I'm going to put you on the spot, okay? I want you to speak for the next minute about dippers. Go.
About what? Sorry?
Dippers. Dippers.
Dippers. You mean the dippers who don't see the birds they look for? No, I'm only joking. Okay, the dipper is the world's only aquatic songbird. It lives in rushing streams because it needs deeply oxygenated water, because that type of water is helpful for the sort of things that it eats, which is mainly insect larvae. When they're the only songbirds in the world that dive down underwater to catch their food, although they're not the only birds that will get small birds that get their feet wet to eat food, because things like rock pipits do as well. And what they do is they basically face into the current, put their head down and walk into the river, holding on with their very strong claws onto these stones or other things on the water, the bottom of the water, and that's how they go in. They also curtsy up and down like that, you know, they'll dip down, and nobody actually knows why they do that. It's probably so that other dippers can see them. Have I done a minute yet, David?
You've done 2 minutes and I think you're great, so you don't have to do any more. It's interesting because, you know, I've always been fascinated by kind of facts about birds, and, you know, I've often read stuff in the past and just hear that churned out over and over again. So it's really interesting reading your articles when you actually kind of learn about a completely new aspect. I learned the other day, for example, that there's a species called the black wheatear, which, you know, maybe some of the Zoomers know. Black wheatear, member of the chat family, and lives in sort of the Mediterranean, I suppose, Iberia and into North Africa. It has a distinction of being the strongest bird on the planet for its size, because apparently, even though it's the size of a starling, I suppose, it can lift pebbles and stones to decorate its nest, which are, I think, 3/4 of its own weight, which is fantastic. And also, what I love about facts and figures, I love bird facts. I mean, I love doing bird quizzes. In fact, in 2017, I was Bird Brain of Britain at Bird Fair, only on the facts, because my chosen subject was sand grouse of the world, and I was the world's expert on that at that moment
Yes.
when I was doing the quiz. But the other guys knew more about their own subjects. But then when it came to general knowledge, I thought, yeah, because a lot of those guys didn't know their general knowledge, and that's how I won it.
I don't know. I was watching you thinking this guy is brilliant. And something about black wheatears, you know, of course, that the female black wheatears actually judge the quality of the males by the number of rocks they bring outside their nest.
So it depends. They look at the powerlifting aspects. They must be looking at seeing, oh, that guy's ripped. That male black wheat is ripped.
And the thing is that it's not even part of the nest. It's just decorated like a bower for a bower bird. And the females can just look at the nest and think, oh, I don't want to get involved with him. And one black wheat has been known to bring, I think it's 400 stones to its nest.
Incredible.
This is our garden bird we're talking about, isn't it, David?
Well, it's a garden bird for some people. I mean, in Spain here, there's for example, there's a town called Nachos, and they actually go in people's gardens, theoretically. I mean, I've seen them in people's gardens, so yeah.
It's endemic to Iberia in North Africa too. It's a pretty special bird.
Yeah.
And please ask the question, do other wheatears do that? No, they don't. Just the black one.
Okay, so that's a question from Claire there.
Yes.
So basically, before we go and talk about garden birds, I'm sure everyone's on about garden birds. Can you just, what's the most weird fact that you ever come across whilst researching? You know, what's the most interesting fact you've come across that you can think of?
One that's not a bird.
Yeah, whatever.
One of my favourite facts.
Natural history, though, yeah.
Oh yeah. No, I read the book. It was sort of full of it. It was called Extreme Animals, and it's about I think it's a bacterium or something like that. It's called trichostomiasis or something like that. Anyway, this it may not be a bacterium. I think it's a single-celled animal. Anyway, and it affects quite a lot of different animals, but it's most at home and reproduces most happily in the stomach of a cat, a feline. So I think it's a single-celled animal. Anyway, when this, I think it's called trichostoma or something like that, when it's ingested by a rat or a mouse, it sends out a chemical into the brain of the rodent, and the rodent suddenly becomes unafraid of cats. And so when it's infected, it's unafraid of the cats, and in fact, rather than run away from the cat, it runs towards it, and then the cat eats it, and the microbe finds its way back into the stomach of a cat.
That's amazing.
Which is pretty good. And termites will blow up as well. If a termite mound is threatened by a predator, they send a certain type of termite that basically has a lot of fluid inside it, and it blows up and tries to destroy the predator by blowing up over it.
So it's almost like a bomb.
So, like a what, sorry?
Like a bomb.
Like a bomb, like it's indeed, yeah. Blows up in front of the predator.
Amazing.
So that's quite a fact.
That's a pretty good fact, definitely. Okay, garden birds. Now, one question I'd like to ask about garden birds is what is the definition of a garden bird? Because in North America, in Europe, you can say birds, but then if you go to Australia and you say garden bird, people say, what? They seem to behave differently there, the birds generally, they're more dramatic. So what's your definition of a garden bird?
That's actually a really good question. I think in America they call them backyard birds, don't they? And it's essentially birds which are adapted to the human environment, really. It's as simple as that. There are quite a few garden birds in Australia. if you think about it, fairy wrens and at least in the eastern suburbs of around Australia, there's a lot of quite a lot of garden birds there. I think that it's just a bird you see from a garden, really, and it's birds that are usually they usually originate in woodland, open woodland, and they find the garden environment, which we understand, a patch of land next to buildings, maybe surrounded by buildings. They find that habitat suitable for living and breeding. Of course, in recent years, this has extended enormously to birds which we can feed or we can look after in some way. And so the birds of our backyard, of our garden, become our birds. And then a lot of people look upon birds in a very personal way as sort of our garden robin or something like that. But I don't think there's a real definition of garden birds. They're just familiar birds, really. I mean, I've got kingfishers in my garden.
Is there a particular family of bird that's more prone to being attracted to gardens? I mean, would it, if there was to be a family, would it be the thrush family? Would it be the tits, or in America, titmouse?
Well, like you said, David, it depends on the part of the world you're in. Obviously, if you're talking about Europe, many of them are indeed thrushes and tits and finches. Finches often come to gardens throughout the world because they like seeds. These are great for seeds, natural seeds as well as other seeds which are put out. If you go to America, you get hummingbirds, of course, and then South America in the gardens, you feed your hummingbird. And in Australia, you've got your honey eaters, which come to sometimes to plants that you actually grow. And so, of course, there are different birds in other gardens, but certain families do seem better disposed. Things like warblers are not really, I'm talking about European warblers. Apart from blackcaps, which are no longer warblers, of course, they're not really particularly prone to living in gardens, despite the fact there's a bird called a garden warbler.
When you say blackcaps are no longer warblers, can you explain that?
Oh, they've been, well, all these lovely taxonomic changes, you might have. They're now back. They're called Sylviid babblers now. They're still called Sylviidae, if the listeners have heard of Sylviidae. But yeah, they've split them away from warblers now, and they're closer to babblers, apparently.
It's interesting with warblers because certainly in Britain and Europe, because obviously in North America, the warblers there are thin-billed buntings, I presume, aren't they? Thin-billed, that's a convergent evolution.
American warblers are very close to finches.
Oh, finches?
Yeah,
okay.
They're close to Fringillidae.
Okay. Well,
sorry, I'm getting a bit opaque here.
Sorry?
I just was apologizing for people if it's getting a bit sort of taxonomically sort of a little bit hard to understand this why they are. As the DNA studies have been done on all these birds, while they've discovered that finches like goldfinch is closer relative to a bird like a Blackburnian warbler or a black and white warbler. They're actually very close, but it's all about DNA.
Yeah, well, just going back to the old warblers.
Yes.
Growing up as a birder, you kind of think warblers are warblers. Okay, you got macrocephalic warblers, you got food warblers and sedge warblers, you got the locustellas, you got the grasshopper warblers and all that, and then you got the Sylvia warblers, blackcaps, and you got the Philoscopus, or whatever, which are the warblers. So you think, oh, it's one big family. And then when you start looking at it again, you've got Chetty's warbler, which is kind of an anomaly because it's got, 12 tail feathers instead of 14 or whatever, and lays black eggs, and people can't, I'm not sure where it's in the family. And you got all the aberrant ones. And then you realize that warblers are like waders, in that they come in all different shapes and sizes, are more closely related to them than others.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Chetty's warbler's got more than any other small bird in the world. I might be wrong about that. If anyone sort of wants to write in and say that's rubbish, but actually they split all the warblers into different families now anyway. So Chetty's warblers in a different family, bush warbler family, and even Philoscopus warblers are in a different family now. The taxonomists love doing things.
The thing is, I mean, as much as it's interesting, some of the taxonomy decisions I cannot accept. I will not accept that falcons are related to parrots and not raptors like hawks and stuff. I can't accept that, I'm sorry. Also, I cannot accept, I'm categorically doing this on record, I cannot accept picking up a guidebook and it starts with geese. It should end with divers and grebes. The thing is, the problem I have is that because of all these taxonomic changes, it means that every time you pick up a new field guide, it's a new order, which means that people learning about birds are going to be confused because every time you pick a book up, you can't find where the birds are. I think there should be a rule whereby you stick to one order. For everyone, there's a universal order if it's a field guide, everyone knows where to look for birds, and it makes it a bit more easy to get into than to change it every 5 minutes. That's me with my soapbox.
I'll drink to that one, David.
Now, Susie Buttress has a question here, actually. You know what, Susie? Do you want to come on?
Hi there. I was just wondering what the best source for taxonomic information might be for the layperson, because it is quite tricky to work out all these different families. And I've tried looking at like Wikipedia and things like that. And some of the more professional ones seem to be behind paywalls, and it gets a little bit tricky to work that out for sort of the layperson. But it's absolutely fascinating what you're saying. And absolutely, David, I've been caught out myself by looking at older guidebooks and then finding out that the families have all changed. Or rather, the birds within the families have changed.
Frustrating.
Yes, the one really good source is the IOC website, the International Ornithological Congress website. At least it will tell you what all the new families are. There is a book coming out by Lynx, I think, in Spain, which is all about the passerines, which is going to explain the major changes they've done in the passerine order. That's the perching birds, as people probably know. But I agree with you both. I feel that for field guides are field guides. They're not taxonomic guides. And I do think they should have perhaps kept the order a little bit more consistent, and at least until it's all worked out. It is very, very confusing for people. And of course, as you both know, anyone listening knows, there are more and more people coming into birding at the moment. And we need a way, an easy entry for them so that they can quickly find the birds they want in a guide. It is a bit of a problem. At least it's not as bad as the botanists whose names are changing for everything there.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks, Susie. Dennis Reardon, I'd like to bring you in now because I'd like you to talk to us about the warblers in America that you get. And do they ever come into your garden? I know you said they don't as a rule, but do you ever get any species coming?
In migration, we might get warblers in the garden, but they're generally not large enough for the birds to nest. Most of the North American warblers, in this area at least, are either passage migrants going much farther north, or they're going to be nesting in forests.
Okay. And so, one more question. What's the bird in your background?
Jackdaw.
Is it?
Yes.
Yeah, it looks like some weird tropical bird. Well, I guess it's a weird tropical bird for someone living in Polynesia.
It looks like a wood swallow, actually. Yeah, just that.
An avior.
You sometimes get yellow rump warblers in the winter?
Not really in the gardens.
Okay.
They're more. They're going to be more in shrubland areas where they can find berries.
Oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense.
So Dennis, what's the classic? You're in Eastern US, aren't you?
Yeah, New England.
Okay, New England. What's your classic garden birds you get there?
Well, my highlight this year was a Baltimore Oriole.
Mhm.
It's coming to get some cat fur that I had combed off my cat and put out for the tufted titmice, and Baltimore Orioles found it and used it for their nest. But we get catbirds, northern mockingbirds, cardinals, house sparrows, and American goldfinches, other finches, chickadees, black-capped chickadee,
American robin.
American robin, yes. The mourning doves, and then occasionally, not really a backyard bird as such, but one that takes advantage of backyards is sharp-shinned hawk, which is coming to feast on garden birds. What else? White-throated sparrow in the winter, juncos in the winter.
Okay, so you have quite a range of interesting birds, which is great. I want to come back to you, actually, Dennis, but let me go to the West Coast. We've got Joe Seal on the West Coast. Tell us about your garden birds, just to get the flow going here.
Okay. Well, I'm in San Diego, and San Diego County actually has the most number of species of any county in the U.S. because we have, the county is huge. We've got the ocean, we've got desert, we've got forest, we've got mountains, and so there's like 500 species around here, but not all at the same time. But typically, like outside right now, there'd be juncos, song sparrows. We don't have house sparrows here, but up the hill we have house sparrows, which is strange. They don't like our house, but they're in the rest of the neighborhood. Seasonally, we get yellow-rumped warblers. As far as like the day-to-day stuff, it's mourning doves, lesser goldfinches. Here, let me look at my eBird. And well, during migration, we'll get like the what are those warblers? The ones that have like the yellow and black stripes. The Townsend warblers. The Townsend warblers sometimes, and the hermit warblers get a lot. The gray, the black-headed gray warbler or gray-headed black warbler. I mean, there's just a lot that migrate through. And then if you go down to the river mouth, it's madness. It's madness down there. During migration, you get down to hundreds and hundreds of birds, and then they're all mixed together, and then it's just very anxiety and try to identify the shorebirds during migration. But we'll get like black-headed grosbeaks, western tanager. That's what's coming to head. Oh, what are they called? The common yellow throats. We have a lot of little togies.
You sound like you have a lot of stuff going on.
We have a lot of stuff going on. It's busy.
What do you think, Dom?
Say again? Me?
I was asking what you thought of all that from our American friends.
Envious, actually. Yeah, I would love to be right over in the States now, actually. I know it's a difficult time for the States, but I just love birding over there, and I know you do as well, David. But one of my favorite North American bird stories, I don't know if the two Americans we've spoken to know if this is true or not, but I read somewhere that the American goldfinch builds a nest out of thistledown, and the nest is so beautifully made that actually, if you pour a glass of water into the nest, it holds the water. Have you heard that? Do you think that's true?
I don't know. We only have, well, the lesser goldfinches here, occasionally American, and occasionally the Lawrence goldfinch, but I haven't seen the nest.
Right.
I believe it. They like thistle down.
Well,
Oh, we have hummingbirds too. Sorry. We have like 3 kinds of hummingbirds all the time.
I haven't seen an American goldfinch nest, but one of my friends reported finding one in a nest box. So I don't know, maybe they made it there, but I think they would have said something if it had been unusual.
Yeah, interesting. Switching back to the old world, Jim Wright has asked a really interesting question about black redstarts. The fact that in Britain they're one of the rarest, if not, one of the rarest breeding birds in Britain. It's only a handful of pairs. Yet you cross over the channel into a place known as Europe, and sometimes they populate around all the towns and cities. Now, I've heard of an interesting theory behind it. I don't know if you agree with this, Dominic. I'll proffer it now and see what you say. But in Europe, well, in Britain, should I say, robin is obviously a very dominant bird. And as you mentioned earlier, it came out of the woodlands and it's now a very sort of familiar birds in probably the familiar bird in the gardens of Britain. That said, my mum, about 10 years ago, came up to me and said, West Indian accent, which I won't repeat, said, David, I've just seen a bird in my garden whilst I was gardening. I said, oh, what was that? Thinking it was something really interesting there. She said, well, it was brown and it had a red breast. Mum, don't ever say that in public again. All right? Anyway, robins are very sort of dynamic and stuff, but they're very aggressive. And I've actually watched attacking redstarts. They seem to attack anything with a red tail, so I've seen them attacking both and black redstarts in urban areas. And so it seems like the robin is dominant over the redstart. But you go to Europe, and because robins are still predominantly tied to their native habitat of woodlands, black redstarts are left alone in towns and cities to breed. So do you think that could be why we have so many black redstarts in the UK?
It's interesting, David. I've not ever heard that before, but it actually makes complete sense to me. I certainly don't have a better theory at all. It is odd, though, that, the black redstart's never been common in Britain, has it? It only became fairly common after the war, the Second World War.
Let me just interrupt you, Dominic. Fact. You're going to love the fact. The first ever breeding record of black redstart in the UK was in my hometown of Wembley in 1993 when they were building Wembley Stadium. That's why I had that interest in because I had an historic moment in my town in London.
That's David. I've got a great fact for you, actually. Can I digress slightly?
So
when do you think rose-ringed parakeets nested in wild in Britain for the first time?
You're asking the wrong question because I think I know the answer. So maybe you should ask the question. Boomers, when was the first ever recorded, what kind of year, what year roughly, was the first ever recorded breeding of the rose-ringed or ring-necked parakeet?
Someone's got it.
Come back with 1897. Do you know where?
Yeah, I was going to say 1896, but yeah, I think that's
1853 actually.
1850.
Where was it?
Oh, it was somewhere really weird, Norfolk or somewhere like that. It was.
I heard it's Great Yarmouth. Great Yarmouth.
Yes. Yeah. You love your odd facts as well, Dave. In fact, you're not the only one because on here love them as well, don't they?
No, but I think you should have had a fact night tonight. Should have been not garden, but bird facts.
know. Daft bird facts we don't actually need to know at all. But, yeah, your theory about black redstarts is really, really interesting. I mean, it is very interesting that robins, European robins, are very dominant. And one of the reasons I've been told is that European robins are very, very tame in Britain because we always loved them. There was, it was the Venerable Bede, apparently about 400 years ago, who first recorded robins being tame. There was a monk who, the robins came and sat on his shoulder. And so they actually, there was something was written long ago about robins being tame here. And at the same time that that was written in Britain, in France, robins and other parts of Europe, robins were only ever mentioned in cookbooks. And so it may be that over the course of time, the robins have become sort of part of the fabric of British life. We always seem to have loved them here, and they've never kind of been attracted out of the woodlands, presumably in France and Germany and elsewhere. And that maybe has given the opportunity for robin to expand its niche here in the UK, where I'm speaking from, maybe at the expense of black redstart. It's quite an interesting thought.
The robin is an interesting bird. I mean, you know, I did my Vote for Britain's National Bird campaign, as you well know, about 4 years ago. And when I went public with it in terms of, you know, public vote, I was lying from the very first moment, trying to get the blackbird, the common blackbird, voted for, because the robin was straight out winning by a country mile from the first day of voting. So when it became Britain's national bird as voted by the public back in 2015, I, to be honest with you, was very disappointed. But then I suddenly realised, actually, robin is a very good candidate because it's small, it's feisty, it's territorial, it picks fight, just like Britain. It's a total fit.
I agree. It's a great bird. It's very popular with gardeners, and no one should ever feel bad about loving robins, should they? And as far as I'm concerned, as long as people love something wild, I don't mind what they love. They love wasps for all. As long as people care about the world generally, I don't mind what it is.
Let's talk briefly about feeding birds. Obviously, garden birds. One of the key elements of a garden bird scenario is bird food. Are you one of the members of the school of that birds should be fed all year round, or do you think that they should really be fed during the winter?
I'm of the school that birds should be fed all year round, not necessarily for the reasons that are always mooted. I think the thing with garden birds is that they are the route that people take from a mild or almost non-present interest in wildlife to a passion for wildlife. So a bit like me with the sparrow, you could have someone who's got an idle moment in their garden. They're looking out of their kitchen window, perhaps, and they suddenly see something interesting, and that attracts them to the study of birds, and that can produce an interest in nature in general. And so anything that can promote interest in birds is, to me, a good thing. And so I would advocate feed, as much for your own enjoyment as it is to help the birds themselves, because the connection we have feeding birds is fantastic. It's a unique one in some ways between us and the natural world. We know we can help birds that way, and we know that they appreciate it. Their survival rates are often better in gardens. And so keep feeding them and don't stop. You might have heard some people say that there could be a threat to the youngsters if you feed garden birds. There's all these stories people used to tell about young birds choking on the wrong sort of food. This is not relevant because those young birds choked on the wrong food would have been fed the wrong food because there wasn't enough of the right sort of thing. And so people should never be for that reason. The only reason not to feed birds in the summer is because it's quite expensive. So
Good point.
that's it.
I was going to say something about the gardens and plants, because it's great. I mean, for example, for me, I started off watching birds in my garden. That's how I started. Pure and simple. My first patch was my back garden, and it was my patch for about 15, 20 years practically. Back gardens are really great if you have them, of course. But
Yes, you may.
the situation is, I think, you know, when I look around, I mean, I've been speaking about this to other people and other in conservation with. In Britain, you look around and there's a lot of gardens that are absolutely atrocious when it comes to attracting nature. People that have astroturf down, that have 3/4 of their garden patios, that have sterile wooden fencing. I remember being in someone's garden once at a barbecue, and it was and I remember him saying, "Oh, there's no birds around here. They're all eaten by magpies and starlings." And I, without thinking, said, "Well, if people don't have gardens with, you know," you explained the patio and the plastic grass, and I suddenly realised that I was describing his, and that was the last time I was invited to his house. But there's a lot of situations like that. Are garden birds in general doing well in the UK?
Gosh, are they doing well in the UK? Yeah, most of them are doing very well because they're in gardens. As a side issue, the biggest problem in British conservation is probably farmland. Really, this is a completely different subject, I appreciate. Birds in gardens are doing generally very well. If you think about a bird like a long-tailed tit, how often did you, when you were a young birder, David, how often did you see long-tailed tits? Probably quite rarely, but now they're everywhere in everyone's garden. Think about goldfinches. I mean, they're doing tremendously well. And the fact that people often quote, I think it's very important. Apologies to the US people here, but in the context of Britain, the gardens of Britain cover a greater area than the whole of our national nature reserves combined. And so gardens are a key player in the fortunes of birds in general. And therefore, every person who is lucky enough to garden or has access to a space that they have some control over can majorly contribute to the fortunes of birds, and also things like hedgehogs, of course. And so I think they're doing very well. It's one of the few places, like certainly in this country, where birds are actually doing well. They're expanding their distributions and generally doing reasonably well. It's all the rest of the country that's has a problem.
Yeah, I was just reading the actual problem States about feeding birds is a very different one to ours. In putting that, I mean, we have a problem that we have to be careful putting out food at certain times. Ground feeding birds, put it in a tray and bring it in every evening. Otherwise, you're attracting guests. Whereas in the US, you may attract guests slightly bigger and perhaps a little bit more dangerous, i.e. black bears that become habituated. So yeah, that's a very good point made there, Dennis. Now, is there anyone in the Zoom, any Zoomers out there who has any questions for Dominic at all? So I've been chatting away. So anyone else has got a question at all that's burning a hole in their chest? Okay, Susie Buttress has asked, I have a behavioural question. Well, let's go. Let's hear it, Susie.
So I've been having rooks visiting my garden for the last 2 years, and one of the rooks has befriended me. And it will come every now and then for a special handful of pellets, because I think it's learned that if it sits close by and gets the pellets, it gets the pellets, whereas the other birds are left sort of not getting anything. But it's totally on the rook's terms. I don't do anything more than just give it an extra handful. But one thing I've noticed the rook do is every now and then it will suddenly bend down and look at its feet as though it's checking its feet are still there. And I can't work out whether it's just a mannerism from that particular rook or if it's some sort of signal that they send to other rooks. It's just, I've never really had close contact with rooks before, so I've not seen these sorts of behaviours. And it might be too specific a question, but it's one of those little burning questions that I've had, and just wondered if you might have any ideas.
It's a very good question. I was, before this podcast began, I was thinking, is anyone going to ask me a question that I have not got?
Sorry.
No, that's fine. I mind not knowing. It's what's wrong with that? Somebody mentioned on the Zoom it could be coughing up a pellet. Obviously, if the pellet comes up, that does answer it. It sounds to me like it's actually what you said. Secondly, it sounds like a display of some kind. I would have to check rook displays in one of my authoritative homes here, research to check. But it does sound to me like some kind of perhaps a veiled threat display. It could even be it could be a sort of, not exactly a thank you display, but a sort of display that isn't aggressive, a little bit more submissive. Could be that. But no, I don't know the answer. But
Yeah. I keep trying to get a video of it, so if I do, I'll send it to you.
Do that. Now, I'll check. I can check my tomes as well, my research books, and see if I can find out.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Susie. The Casual Birder podcast. Let me ask you this question now, as we've come to the point in the evening where the curtains are twitching, closed in the first part of the evening. Can you grace us with the knowledge of your favourite bird?
Is this me you're talking to?
Your name?
My favourite bird is such a difficult question to answer. They're all my favourites, really. I suppose if I had to choose one, as a bird watcher, it would probably be Firecrest. For the American listeners, that's a bird similar to your golden-crowned kinglet. So the Firecrest is the smallest bird in Europe, along with the goldcrest. It's a birder's bird because it's the sort of thing you might come across anywhere. It's a bird that you may not think is exciting, and then when you look at it, it's just stunning. And so you can get it anywhere, and it's always incredibly beautiful. And so there's nothing better in life than very beautiful surprises. So probably that would be the winner. But in the USA, I've got a lot of favourites over there, but I do rather like indigo buntings.
They're pretty gorgeous, absolutely.
And they have, indigo buntings have a wonderful history. They showed that birds learn how to follow the stars on a study in indigo buntings. Because what they did, they had a group of indigo buntings at a research station in the US, and they brought them up from scratch. They hatched them and then they brought them up. They hand-reared indigo buntings, and they had access to a planetarium. And indigo buntings, as all the Americans know, are migratory. And what they found was that some indigo buntings, they reared them, and every day, every night, they would show them a planetarium with a projection of the normal stars and the rotation of the stars. And then that's one group they had, and they had that was their control group. Have another group of indigo buntings, young indigo buntings, that they reared, and every night they would put them in the planetarium, but they reversed stars. So Betelgeuse at the north instead of the North Star. And when the indigo buntings were released, the control birds flew south, as they were supposed to do, but the other ones who had the planetarium projection reversed flew north, and so they flew the wrong way, which proved young birds learn how to navigate by the stars in the nest.
I hope they didn't perish in that experiment.
I hope they didn't. I don't actually know what happened to that. I just put them in registration cages, which would have been a round cage, which shows which direction they wanted to fly in.
Okay.
I hope that's what happened. I'm not quite sure.
So no birds were harmed in that experiment.
We hope not.
If notwithstanding the current pandemic, if you could be anywhere on this planet right this very second, where would it be?
If I wanted to be anywhere, did you say?
Anywhere you want.
I want to be, I can work this out. I bet every bird watcher has. We've had plenty of time, haven't we, in the pandemic to think, oh, if I saw COVID-19, everything returned to normal, where would I like to go? Can I have 2 places?
You can have 3 if you want.
Oh, that's brilliant. First of all, I was very, very lucky to be in Honduras in Central America just before lockdown happened. And I'd just love to go back there because it's such a fantastic country and a very under-visited country, and it needs people to visit to see the wonderful birds there, the quetzals and things like that. But the place I'd love to be, which I've never been to before, you've been, I think, David, and that's Southeast Brazil, the Atlantic forest of Brazil. I'd love to go there. So that would be my favorite place, I think.
Cool, okay. Zoomers, just to let you know that tomorrow night is the final nighttime for UK people anyway, in conservation with Jen Brumfield, who is an American from Cleveland, Ohio. She's amazing. She's a real kind of top-notch birder and very, very crazy when it comes to keeping lists and running after rarities. But juxtapositioned against that is the fact that she does a lot of outreach. She works in parks in Cleveland. She talks to a lot of local people, particularly in the Afro-American community, to get them involved in birding. So we're going to be talking tomorrow night about her life, really. And the final in conservation with, amazing, this idea came to me during lockdown in Spain, which was pretty draconian, and in April. And I just thought, right, next week I'll try it. And it's kind of rolled, and it's been amazing. So I'm really happy to end it, or end this season anyway, with Polly Morgan, who's an artist based in London, and she creates art using taxidermy, even though she's not an official taxidermist. I've actually been with her when she prepared ribbon. She gets all her stuff, all her animals from roadkill, or people send her dead animals, and she keeps her full of dead animals. And her art sells 6. So, you know, that'd be an interesting one. Unfortunately for our American cousins, it's at 10:30 a.m. British Standard Time, which means you have to be up late to watch this. You can see it in playback. So, with no further ado, I just want to say thank you very much for you, Dominic, for coming along today and talking to us ostensibly about garden birds, but generally having a chat about birds, which has been great.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure. Great to chat to you. And Jen Brumfield, I know Jen, she will be fantastic. So I hope everyone will log in tomorrow night as well. She's tremendous fun, isn't she?
Yes,
Thank you so much.
No problem at all. She's a great laugh. No problem at all. Zoomers, as ever, thank you very much for being here. And I wish you well, and I hope that everyone's looking up and taking care of themselves and others.